The military has a way of testing you before the enemy ever gets a chance. It usually happens in a cramped, foul-smelling room where egos take up more space than oxygen. When the big guy asked for her rank, he expected a punchline. He didn't expect to be saluting. The heat in Camp Lemonnier didn't just oppress you. It swallowed you. It tasted like diesel exhaust, stale sweat, and the fine, powdery dust of the Horn of Africa that found its way into your teeth, your rifle action, and eventually, your soul. Celine Collins sat in the corner of the Joint Operations Center, a dilapidated plywood structure held together by duct tape and the sheer stubborn will of the United States military. She didn't look up as the door kicked open. She didn't need to. The heavy, syncopated thud of combat boots and the immediate, booming laughter told her everything she needed to know. The new detachment had arrived. Alpha Platoon, fresh off a rotation in Coronado, full of calories, unearned confidence, and the kind of swagger that usually gets a man shot in his first real firefight. Collins kept her eyes on her hands. She was stripping a Sig Sauer P226, her fingers moving with the thoughtless, mechanical grace of a woman who had done it in pitch blackness, underwater, and while bleeding. Her hands told a story her face refused to. They were ruined, calloused, scarred, the knuckles permanently swollen, the skin a map of jagged white lines earned against coral reefs and rusted ship hulls. She wore standard desert Marpat camis. No unit patches, no name tapes. Her sleeves were uncharacteristically buttoned all the way down to the wrists, a habit she'd picked up to avoid the sun and, more importantly, to avoid the inevitable conversations. She had spent 34 years on this earth, the last 10 in the Navy, and the last 3 breaking through a ceiling made of Kevlar and institutional bias. She was tired of talking. She was here to work. At the center of the room, Marshall was holding court. He was a textbook operator, 6'2", built like a brick outhouse, sporting a dense beard that barely fell within regulations, and a dip of Copenhagen tucked into his lower lip. He threw his helmet onto the plywood briefing table, the heavy thud rattling the coffee mugs. His men, 4 younger guys who looked at him like he was a minor deity, fanned out behind him, claiming chairs, dropping gear, taking up maximum space. "Someone tell me the AC is just taking a breather," Marshall announced to the room at large, wiping a hand across his forehead. "Because if I have to sweat through my plate carrier before we even cross the wire, I'm billing SOCOM for dry cleaning." A few polite chuckles rippled through the room. The support staff, intelligence analysts, comms guys, a couple of logistics officers, smiled nervously. You always smiled when the shooters made a joke. It was the natural order of things, the food chain. Marshall's eyes swept the room, taking inventory. He looked past the analysts. He looked past the radio operators. His gaze landed briefly on Collins in the corner, paused, categorized her, and moved on. To Marshall, a woman sitting alone in a sterile uniform, quietly maintaining a sidearm, meant one thing: support staff. Maybe an intel liaison from Langley, maybe a specialized medic. Useful, sure, but not the tip of the spear. Collins felt the dismissal. It was a physical sensation, as familiar as the recoil of a rifle. She didn't flinch. She just snapped the slide back onto the frame of her SIG, the metallic clack sharp and loud in the muggy air. "All right, let's get this over with," Marshall said, turning his back to her and leaning over the central table. "Where's the OIC? We were told there was a tactical brief at 1400. We've got a target in the Chabelle region, and I want my boys wheels up by nightfall." An Air Force tech cleared his throat. "Sir, the operational commander is here. We're just waiting on the satellite imagery to finish rendering." "Good," Marshall grunted. "Because the intel packet we got on the flight over was a joke. Amateurs wrote it. I need real eyes on this compound before I send my guys into a blind breach." Collins slid her sidearm into its Kydex holster. The satisfying click of the retention lock made Marshall glance over his shoulder. She stood up. She wasn't exceptionally tall, 5'8" maybe, but she carried herself with a dense, grounded gravity. She didn't walk. She occupied space efficiently. She moved to the briefing table, her boots silent on the plywood floor. She picked up the printed intel packet Marshall had casually tossed aside. "The packet isn't a joke," Collins said. Her voice was low, raspy from inhaling too much sand over the years. "It's redacted. The compound isn't a standard militia hideout. It's a fortified stronghold. Al-Shabaab has been holding a French NGO worker there for 3 weeks." Marshall turned fully around now, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He looked down at her with a mixture of amusement and irritation. It was the look a mastiff gives a terrier. "I appreciate the summary, sweetheart," Marshall said, his tone dripping with patronizing patience. "But reading the cover page of a dossier isn't exactly tactical insight. When the shooter teams go in, we need to know the structural integrity of the walls. We need to know the fields of fire, things you don't get from sitting behind a desk." The room went dead silent. The Air Force tech suddenly found his boots fascinating. The comms guys stopped typing. The air in the room felt like it was thickening, the ambient hum of the dying AC unit suddenly sounding like a jet engine. Collins looked at Marshall. She didn't glare. She didn't puff out her chest. She just looked at him with the flat, deadpan stare of someone who had seen men blown in half and had to keep eating her MRE. "The structural integrity," Collins said quietly, "is mud brick over reinforced steel rebar. They laid it 2 years ago. The satellite doesn't show it because the thermal bloom from the generator masks the density of the walls." Marshall's smirk faltered slightly. "That wasn't in the packet. And the fields of fire," she continued, stepping closer to the table, her finger tracing a blurry line on the map, "are heavily concentrated on the north and east walls. They have 2 DS-inch heavy machine guns mounted on the roof, depressed to cover the primary approach. If you try a standard explosive breach on the north wall, like your unit SOP dictates, you will be cut to pieces before the dust even clears." Marshall stared at the map, then back at Collins. His jaw tightened. The alpha male programming in his brain was short-circuiting. A woman in a sterile uniform was dissecting his standard operating procedure and predicting his failure. And worse, she sounded like she knew exactly what she was talking about. His squad shifted uncomfortably behind him. The easy locker room vibe was gone, replaced by a sudden, prickly tension. "Look," Marshall said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the joking edge. "I don't know who briefed you, or what agency you belong to. CIA, NSA, whatever. You guys are great at gathering the puzzle pieces, but we're the ones who have to kick the door and put it together. My guys train for this every single day. Your training won't stop a 12.7mm round from tearing through your plates, Marshall," Collins replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. She knew his name. She knew his unit. She knew exactly how many deployments he had. Marshall took a step toward her. He was trying to use his size, leaning in, a classic intimidation tactic. "And how exactly do you know what my unit's SOP is, or what a DSHK round does to body armor?" Collins held her ground. She didn't lean back. She just looked up into his eyes, her expression utterly bored. "Because I read your after-action reports," she said. "You rely heavily on shock and awe, kinetic entries. You like the noise. It works in the movies. It works against untrained insurgents. It will get your men killed tonight." Marshall let out a short, harsh laugh. It was a defensive sound. He looked back at his men, seeking validation, then turned back to Collins. The frustration was boiling over into arrogance. He decided to play the ultimate trump card. The military hierarchy. Okay, let's clear the air here. Marshall said, leaning his hands on the table and smirking. You've got a lot of opinions for a liaison. I'm an O3, a Navy lieutenant. I command a SEAL platoon. What exactly is your role here? Better yet, I'm sorry, what's your rank again? Do they even give you guys real ranks in the air-conditioned tents, or do you just collect GS pay grades? It was the oldest insult in the book. The line drawn in the sand between the trigger pullers and the pencil pushers. The silence in the room stretched to the breaking point. The intelligence analysts were collectively holding their breath. They knew something Marshall didn't. Collins didn't sigh. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't unleash a fiery speech about equality or the trials she had faced to get here. Words were cheap. She was profoundly, deeply exhausted by having to justify her existence in rooms like this. Instead, she reached up with her right hand and pinched the fabric of her left sleeve, right at the wrist cuff. She unbuttoned it. Marshall watched, a condescending half-smile still plastered on his face, expecting her to reveal some obscure intelligence badge, or maybe just walk away in frustration. Collins rolled the thick marpat fabric up her forearm. Once, twice, past the scarred, ruined wrist, past the thick ropes of muscle on her forearm. She rolled it all the way up past her bicep, securing the sleeve high on her shoulder. She turned her arm slightly, exposing the outside of her shoulder and the pale skin of her bicep to the harsh fluorescent lights of the JOC. There was no unit patch on her uniform. She didn't need one. The patch was permanently etched into her skin. It was a tattoo, faded, scarred, and undeniably real. A golden eagle clutching a US Navy anchor, a flintlock pistol, and a trident. The SEAL Special Warfare insignia. The Budweiser. But it wasn't just the trident that made the blood drain from Marshall's face. Directly above the trident, inked in stark block letters, was the number 234. And wrapping around the emblem was a massive, jagged, puckered scar. The unmistakable crater of a high-caliber gunshot wound that had taken a chunk of flesh and bone. Marshall recognized the class number. Everyone in the teams knew that number. It was a legacy class, a class that had gone through hell and produced some of the most hardened operators in the modern era. But that was impossible. Then Marshall's eyes flicked to the Velcro panel on the shoulder pocket of her combat shirt, right next to the rolled-up fabric. Pinned to the Velcro, subdued in flat black metal, was a single oak leaf. Lieutenant Commander, an O4. She outranked him. She out-experienced him. And based on the scar and the silence of the room, she had bled out here while he was still running obstacle courses in California. Marshall didn't step back physically, but his entire demeanor collapsed inward. The broad shoulders slumped. The smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden, sickening realization of exactly who he was talking to, and exactly how badly he had miscalculated. He had heard the rumors. The teams were small, word travels. The first woman to make it through Buddy S., the one who refused to do press tours, the one who quietly integrated into a Tier 1 element, took a bullet in the shoulder during a hostage rescue in Yemen, and refused a medical discharge. McIntyre, Marshall breathed out, the name slipping from his lips like a curse. "It's Collins now," she said softly, her voice still entirely devoid of emotion. "I got married and divorced. It happens when you spend 10 years living out of a rucksack." She let her arm drop to her side, the sleeve remaining pinned up, the trident and the silver oak leaf glaring at him. "You're the OIC," Marshall said. "It wasn't a question. I am the officer in charge of this joint task force," Collins confirmed. "I wrote the tactical portion of that packet you called a joke. I spent 3 weeks embedded with local assets tracking this compound, and I am telling you, Lieutenant, that if you breach the North Wall, I will be writing letters to the mothers of those boys standing behind you." Marshall swallowed hard. The silence in the room wasn't fearful anymore. It was respectful. The natural order had reasserted itself, but the food chain looked different than he had assumed. "Yes, ma'am," Marshall said. His voice was tight, stripped of all its former bravado. He snapped to attention, a rigid textbook posture that felt almost comical after his earlier display. "At ease, Marshall," Collins said, turning her attention back to the map. She didn't gloat. She didn't demand an apology. That was the most devastating part of it all. She didn't care about his ego. She only cared about the mission. "We are going to breach from the south," Collins said, tapping a seemingly blank spot on the satellite imagery. "There's a subterranean drainage pipe that empties into a dry wadi 50 meters from the wall. You will low crawl through human waste and mud for 30 minutes. You will breach quietly, and you will secure the hostage before they even know you are on the property." She looked up, locking eyes with him one last time. "Are we clear on the tactical insight, Lieutenant?" Marshall nodded, his eyes locked on the table. "Crystal clear, Commander." The insertion was a masterclass in misery. 2 hours after the briefing, a modified MH-60 Black Hawk dropped Marshall and his team in the scrubland 6 kilometers south of the target. From there, it was a foot patrol through the pitch-black Somali desert. The air was a suffocating blanket. The thermal optics on their helmets painted the dead world in a grainy, glowing green. Back in the Joint Operations Center, Collins sat bathed in the cool blue light of a Predator drone feed. She hadn't moved from her chair in 3 hours. A lukewarm cup of terrible military coffee sat untouched by her right hand. The room was deathly quiet, save for the hum of the servers and the occasional static-laced burst of radio chatter in her earpiece. "TOC, this is Alpha 1. We are at the insertion point for the pipe," Marshall's voice. It sounded thin over the radio, lacking the booming resonance it carried in the briefing room. Collins pressed the push-to-talk pedal under her boot. "Copy, Alpha 1. ISR shows negative movement in the courtyard. The DSHK teams are static on the north roof. You are clear to proceed into the tunnel. Acknowledge." "Solid copy. Going dark." 6,000 miles away from the Pentagon, 5 Tier 1 operators lowered themselves into a concrete drainage pipe that had spent the better part of a decade collecting runoff water, feral animal carcasses, and human waste. The stench hit Marshall first. It bypassed his nose and tasted metallic in the back of his throat. The pipe was exactly 3 feet in diameter. They couldn't crouch. They couldn't crawl on their hands and knees. They had to low crawl on their bellies, dragging their customized MK-18 rifles through the sludge, their Kevlar helmets scraping the curved concrete ceiling. Every yard was agonizing. The mud sucked at their plate carriers. The confined space amplified the sound of their own ragged breathing. Panic is a contagious thing in tight spaces, but these men were professionals. They pushed the claustrophobia down into a dark, locked box in their minds and kept dragging themselves forward. In the JOC, Collins watched the thermal feed. 5 small white heat signatures moving agonizingly slow beneath the dark mass of the compound walls. "They're moving too slow," the Air Force tech whispered, standing behind Collins's chair. "They have 45 minutes before the guard shift change. If they're caught in the pipe, they won't be," Collins said. Her voice was flat. She didn't look back at him. She stared at the screen, her ruined left hand subconsciously tracing the raised scar on her shoulder. She remembered the suffocating weight of the dark. She knew exactly what Marshall was feeling right now. The burn in the triceps, the abrasive sting of the mud grinding into the forearms, the primal urge to stand up. "Commander," the COAM's operator said, "we have movement on the north wall. The heavy gunners are racking their weapons. They're looking at something." Collins leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Push the drone feed north. What are they looking at?" The camera slewed. A mile up the road, a pair of wild dogs were fighting over a piece of trash. The noise had spooked the guards. "They're jumpy," Collins muttered. She keyed the mic. "Alpha 1, sit rep." Static. Then a whispered response, tight with exertion. 30 meters out. This pipe is a graveyard, TOC. "Keep moving, Marshal. Guards on the north wall are awake and on the guns. Do not make a sound when you breach." 10 minutes later, the lead man, Hayes, reached the grate. He used bolt cutters, working methodically, wrapping the heavy steel jaws in thick cloth to deaden the metal-on-metal snap. They emerged into the dry wadi. The night air, previously oppressive, now felt like a godsend compared to the rotting air of the pipe. They were covered head to toe in thick, black sludge. It caked their rifles, their night vision goggles, their faces. They looked like swamp monsters. They looked exactly how Collins intended them to look. Invisible against the dark mud walls of the compound, they stacked up on the southern wall. No explosive charges, no shock and awe. Marshall signaled Hayes. A specialized hydraulic jack was slipped between the heavy wooden frame and the mud brick of the rear access door. With a sickeningly quiet crackle of splintering wood, the locking bar snapped. They were in. "TOC, Alpha is inside the wire." Marshall keyed his mic. "Copy, Alpha," Collins replied. "Target structure is the secondary building on your 2 o'clock. Move." They flowed through the shadows like liquid. The training kicked in, superseding the exhaustion. 2 guards were smoking cigarettes outside the target building. Marshall took the one on the left. Jackson took the right. 2 suppressed coughs from their rifles. The guards dropped into the dust without a sound, their brains scrambled by subsonic 300 blackout rounds before they even knew they were under attack. They breached the main room. 3 men inside, 1 sleeping, 2 playing cards. The hostage, a thin, bearded man in filthy clothes, was chained to a radiator in the corner. The engagement lasted exactly 4 seconds. Target identification. Trigger squeeze. Transition. The room smelled of cordite, copper, and unwashed bodies. "TOC, this is Alpha 1. Jackpot. We have the package. He is breathing." In the jock, a collective, heavy exhale swept the room. The analysts slumped in their chairs. The Air Force tech wiped his forehead. Collins didn't blink. The job wasn't done until the boots were on the ramp. "Copy, Alpha 1. Prep for exfil. You're taking the same route back." "Negative, TOC." Marshall's voice came back, slightly breathless. "Package has a shattered femur. He can't crawl through that pipe. We need an external breach for extraction." Collins's eyes darted across the screens. This was the friction, the moment the plan frays at the edges. "Stand by," she said. She pulled up the structural schematics. If they blew a hole in the wall now, the entire compound would wake up. The DSHK guns on the north roof would tear the courtyard to shreds. She needed to blind them. "Comms, patch me through to the AC-130 on loiter over grid Juliet 4. "Patched, Commander. Spooky 2-2. This is Task Force TOW C. Requesting immediate kinetic diversion on the northeast approach road." "Give me a show." A moment of static. "Copy. Tiuk. Raining fire." A mile away from the compound, the sky tore open. The AC-130 gunship unleashed a sustained burst from its 40mm Bofors cannon onto an empty stretch of desert road. The deafening, rhythmic thump-thump-thump rattled the windows of the compound. Instantly, the entire insurgent garrison panicked, believing they were under a massive armored assault from the north. The heavy gunners on the roof swung their weapons toward the road and opened fire blindly into the night. Tracers lit up the sky like a neon thunderstorm. "Marshal, go!" Collins barked into the radio. "North wall is occupied. Blow the south gate and move to the extraction point now." The explosive breach shattered the night. The southern gate blew outward in a cloud of pulverized mud and splintered wood. Marshall and Jackson carried the hostage by his arms and belt, sprinting into the darkness of the wadi, while Hayes laid down covering fire. By the time the insurgents realized the actual assault had come from behind them, Alpha Platoon was already gone, swallowed by the desert. Dawn broke over Camp Lemonnier with a bruised purple light. The air was already beginning to bake. Collins stood on the edge of the tarmac as the MH-60 touched down, kicking up a blinding cloud of sand. She crossed her arms, the sleeves of her uniform rolled down and neatly buttoned at the wrists. The 04 rank insignia was back on her collar. The scars were hidden. Medical teams rushed the helicopter as the ramp dropped. They loaded the French NGO worker onto the stretcher and sprinted toward the surgical tent. He looked terrible, but he was alive. He would go home to his family. Then Marshall's team walked down the ramp. They looked like they had been dragged through hell. The mud from the pipe had dried into a crusty grey armor on their uniforms. They smelled so profoundly awful that the ground crew physically recoiled as they walked past. Their faces were hollow, their eyes ringed with exhaustion. The adrenaline had crashed, leaving only the bone-deep ache of the job. They didn't look like Greek gods anymore. They looked like mortal men who had barely survived a meat grinder. Collins stood perfectly still as they approached. The men walked past her, their heads heavy. Hayes gave her a brief, exhausted nod. Jackson mumbled a raspy, "Morning, ma'am." Marshall was the last to step off the tarmac. He stopped a few feet from her. He slung his rifle over his chest. His beard was matted with dried sludge. He smelled of sewage, cordite, and cold sweat. He looked at her, really looked at her. He wasn't looking at a liaison anymore. He wasn't looking at a woman in a sterile uniform. He was looking at the ghost of Bud S. Class 234. He was looking at the architect of his survival. "The north wall," Marshall said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "What about it, Lieutenant?" Collins asked quietly. "When we hit the south gate, I looked back over my shoulder," Marshall said, swallowing hard. "When the gunship fired, those DSHKs on the roof opened up. They stripped the bark off the trees 100 yards out. If we had pushed the north wall like I wanted..." He trailed off. He didn't need to finish the sentence. If they had pushed the north wall, they would be coming home in aluminum transfer cases. "SOPs are designed for the middle of the bell curve, Marshall," Collins said, her tone devoid of the biting sarcasm he might have expected. She sounded tired, just deeply, profoundly tired. "The enemy doesn't live in the middle of the curve. They live on the edges. You have to meet them there." Marshall nodded slowly. He looked down at the tarmac, then back up at her. The ego that had filled the briefing room yesterday was gone. It had been burned away in the darkness of that pipe. He didn't offer a flowery apology. He didn't ask for her forgiveness. Men in this line of work didn't operate on apologies. They operated on action. Marshall snapped to attention. It wasn't the exaggerated, slightly sarcastic stance from the briefing room. It was crisp. It was perfect. He brought his right hand up to the brim of his filthy helmet in a textbook salute. "Thank you for the overwatch, Commander," he said softly. Collins looked at him for a long moment. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes. She knew the nightmares he was going to have tonight. The smell of the mud that he would never quite be able to scrub out of his skin. She raised her ruined right hand and returned the salute. "Get some sleep, Marshall. Write your after-action report. And take a shower. You smell like a corpse." A faint, cracked smile broke through the dried mud on Marshall's face. "Yes, ma'am." He turned and walked toward the barracks, his boots dragging in the dirt. Collins stood alone on the tarmac for a few minutes, watching the sun crest the horizon, painting the base in harsh, unforgiving gold. Her shoulder throbbed. The scar tissue always ached when the temperature shifted. She unbuttoned her left sleeve, rolling it up just far enough to feel the morning breeze on the faded ink of the trident. She didn't do it for an audience this time. There was no one left to prove anything to. She rolled the sleeve back down, buttoned it tight, and turned back toward the windowless plywood box of the JOC. There were reports to file. There was intelligence to analyze. There was another target somewhere out in the dark. The military had a way of testing you. Collins had passed a long time ago. Now she was just the one grading the papers. Respect isn't given in the teams. It's paid for in blood, sweat, and silence. Commander Collins didn't need a loud voice to command a room. She let her scars do the talking. The ego is heavy, but experience is the only armor that stops a bullet. If you loved this story of quiet professionalism and earned respect, hit that like button, share it with someone who appreciates real leadership, and subscribe to the channel for more grounded, hard-hitting stories. Let us know in the comments, how would you have handled Marshall's ego?